a pleasure to announce our next session. Manu S Pillai is the author of the award-winning The Ivory Throne, Rebel Sultans, the Courtesan, the Mahatma, and the Italian Brahmin, and most recently, False Allies, India's Maharajas in the Age of Ravi Varma. Formerly Chief of Staff to Dr. Shashi Tharoor, he has in the past worked at the House of Lords in Britain and with the BBC on their Incarnations History series. Manu also wrote a weekly column for Mint Lounge, as well as several other publications.
Thank you everybody for coming. Thank you Sarmaya. And thank you especially Paul, because many years ago, 6 years ago, at a dinner at which Paul was present, which is where we met for the first time, I was cribbing about some material I was unable to find when I was doing my research for my first book. And it turned out that Paul knew the person who had that particular diary that I had been questing after. The auction house that sold it wouldn't tell me who had it, but Paul knew the answer. And he got me a contact, he put me in touch via email, and I was able to finally use that material in this book. So, 6 years down the line, it wasn't, I couldn't use it in the first book, but finally managed in this one. Now the book, it's called False Allies, India's Maharajas in the Age of Ravi Varma. If you look at the cover of the book, you'll see it's got this nice choir type picture of all these princely rulers standing together. They're wearing their velvet clothes and lots of jewelry, and they're all looking very fine and handsome directly at the viewer. And this was made at one of the Delhi Darbars, which was these, every now and then the British used to have these gatherings where they would line up the Maharajas, have them trot out in front of the world, in front of the cameras, and show how they were all loyal allies and pillars of the British Empire. But there was more to the story, which is why I called the book False Allies, because so much for the official line that they were allies, in reality there was a lot more complication to that whole narrative. Now, let's begin with what we know about the princely states. The Palards did a wonderful presentation which, let's say, is a micro-history of princely India. It's one princely state, Cochin, and we've seen what a towering woman could do and achieve in that particular enclave. But if you look at the macro picture, you usually ask people to shut their eyes and imagine the Maharajas, no matter which part of the world you're in. The image that people get is dancing girls, people riding elephants, lots of jewelry, lots of very fine jewelry as it happens, lots of money. Apparently one Maharaja wanted to kill himself and he decided to do it drinking champagne and then sort of overdosing on champagne, which was a very Maharaja-esque style of dying, I suppose. So the idea that we get from the general picture of the Maharajas is excess, it's extravagance, it's luxury. But there was obviously more to the story. The cliche, there's this one memorable story which I remember reading in that famous book, Freedom at Midnight, when I was in my teens. And for some years it did inform my own idea of what the Maharajas were, where they say that, the Nizam of Hyderabad, who was the premier prince in India, he was called His Exalted Highness. Now in Patiala there was apparently a Maharaja who had a huge harem with hundreds of wives. And they say that the joke was that if the Nizam was His Exalted Highness, the Patiala Maharaja was called His Exhausted Highness, because he had far too many wives, and apparently he had a team of plastic surgeons, on call, so that every now and then he could go and change their features based on whatever the latest Paris magazine said was stylish and good looks for women. Which is obviously an exaggeration. It isn't true that that happened. These are the kinds of cliches and stereotypes that have spread about the Maharajas, and they make for a good story. They make for a good laugh, as we just saw. But then, what is the more complicated story? To begin with, it wasn't the case that these people were just dressing up, riding elephants. The typical line I use is that you get the impression that they woke up in the morning, oppressed a few people, then they went and watched their dancing girls in the afternoon, then they rode elephants in the evening, trampled some people on the way, and then in the evening for dinner they would again oppress people. That's the general picture you get. But there is mischief in this retelling. To begin with, why are the Maharajas important? Because 40% of the Indian subcontinent, even under the British, was ruled by the Maharajas. And we saw in one princely state alone, 18% of the revenue being spent on education. That's not something anybody talks about. 40% is a huge chunk of the Indian subcontinent. When we talk about modern Indian history, most of us are speaking about British-ruled India. We forget this other chunk, which is equally a part of our heritage, equally a part of what it means to be Indian, our historical evolution, but it's completely eclipsed. Nobody talks about it. In this 40%, one of the first draft constitutions written in India was in the princely states. The kind of expenses that were, the kind of expenditure that was put out for road building, for institutions, etc., it was in the princely states. And no, the Rajas were not just riding elephants. In Cochin, in fact, as he said, as Mr. Pallad said, the Raja used to get an allowance. The Diwan could actually even say no to the Raja. If the Raja said, oh look, I want to perform this particular ceremony, it's going to cost me X figure, the Diwan could say, no, this is not coming out of the state budget, you can find it from your private resources. That's how it's going to work. Now, in the princely states, you take multiple stories and you'd realize that these were also places which had their own forms of resistance, which had their own forms of people standing up to the British and questioning the British Empire. No, it was not mass movements. It was not like the Rajas got out on the street with Gandhiji and shouted slogans against the British. That wasn't the way they did it. It was more creative. Because ultimately they had there were limitations as to the way and the strategies they could follow to attack the British. Now, for example, in Travancore, which is a state I've studied a great deal, in the 1830s, or late 1820s, 1829 to be exact, there was a young Raja who came to power, and then there was this one order that came from Madras, and the British governor said, this has to be read out at your darbar. Now, this was not an order the Raja liked. He did not want to read this out because it made him look bad. It lowered his political dignity. Now, his options were limited. He couldn't call out an army and go to war against the British. He couldn't defy the British governor. So he said, okay, fine, the orders come in Malayalam and in English. I'll read out the English one, but spare me the Malayalam because I don't want to demean myself in front of my subjects. The British said, no, you have to read out the Malayalam one because the point is that you need to be demeaned in front of your subjects. So Raja does his hemming and hawing. He says, okay, fine, you insist, then I will read the proclamation in Malayalam also. So the darbar is called, there's this huge fanfare, the British resident arrives, lots of bells being rung, all of that. And then both the proclamations are read. Except that when the Malayalam proclamation is read, the Raja makes sure that nobody who understands Malayalam is present in the room. So he makes sure that the British get their way, but he also makes sure that his political dignity is not compromised. Sometimes you have to read the princes between the lines. There's this one Raja of Indore called Tukojirao Holkar. And he writes this letter in the 1870s where he talks about how India was just this heap of stones and then it was the British who came and united the country and built up this wonderful edifice. It's a line the British themselves use a great deal, that they brought unity to India, they gave us a sense of identity and so on. And so you read this letter and you think, okay, here, slavish Raja, he's groveling, he's sort of completely sucking up to the British. But then you read the private correspondence about the same man in the British intelligence reports and they describe him as notoriously disloyal, as somebody who's patently anti-British. Because why? He's secretly in touch with other Maharajas, rankling them up against the British. He's found ways to sort of resist them in other ways. And for example, they would, he imported a chief minister, a divan. And the British knew the moment he imported this chief minister that this was to fight with the British because this was a very talented man. And a Raja, if he succeeds at governance, if he succeeds at running his state well, the British have no locus standi then to intervene in those princely states. So you bring a very hoity-toity, great, charismatic, interesting divan. It's a way of telling the British, now you keep your distance and mind your business. A lot of these divans were actually brought in from the British bureaucracy themselves. But what you see is the moment they come over to the princely side, they actually become loyal to the Maharajas. Because they also had an interest and an incentive in supporting other Indians. Ultimately, what was British India? 40% of Indian subcontinent was Indian-ruled India. The princely states, that is. It was Indian princes with Indian ministers, with an Indian bureaucracy ruling over Indians. Sometimes there'd be British divans, etc. Often they would be foisted on the Rajas if the British felt that progress wasn't happening as they would have liked. But ultimately, this was about Indians ruling themselves in certain ways. Which is why for the longest time, the Congress party and the princes were actually pretty friendly with each other. We imagine that the Congress and the nationalists, they were anti-British and they were anti-Rajas as well, but in reality that wasn't the case. For the longest time, a lot of the funding of the Congress party in the early years came from the princely states. Travancore, Baroda, Mysore, these were the states that were giving to the Congress party, funding their annual exercises and annual meetings. Dadabhai Nauroji, since we're in Bombay, was one of the first Indians to win an election to the House of Commons. His election campaign was funded by multiple Maharajas, Sayajirao Gaekwad of Baroda in the main, but several Maharajas in Western India. The same Tukojirao Holkar of Indore, the guy who wrote the groveling letter, He's the same man who, while he wrote that letter, also gave a 25,000 rupee donation to Nauroji's East India Association in London, where right under the nose of Queen Victoria, they would be basically pointing out that British rule was bad for India. So he was basically playing a kind of double game. In fact, there were Maharajas who played the double game very well. In Jaipur, there was Ram Singh in 1857, when the Great Rebellion broke out. He officially pledged loyalty to the British, but the British armies that sort of passed through Jaipur could see that it was actually very, very, very restless, and that the people were just yearning for a fight. Except at that particular juncture, it didn't suit him to fight them. Tukojirao Holkar similarly, sat on the fence, officially pledged allegiance to the British, and then coolly looked the other way as his army rebelled and went and joined the mutineers. And when they did, he said, "Oops, I don't know. I have no control over my army. The army is completely out of my orders. They're not listening to me." He was playing both sides of the equation. The Scindias of Gwalior, they had till the 1840s tens of thousands of people in their army, a very, very powerful princely state. As late as the 1870s, the British were horrified to find that they were still minting coins in the name of the Mughal emperor, not in the name of Queen Victoria. And then, of course, they went and said that, look, you must stop doing this. Resistance, as I said, the Darbar incident that I mentioned with the two proclamations, this resistance often took the form of ritual also, because the one place where the Maharajas could keep the British in their place, tell them that you are actually smaller than us, was in the court, was in the avenue or in the space of ceremony and ritual. So for instance, in multiple princely states, the British residents, who were like the local agents of the company, the East India Company and then later Queen Victoria, they would insist that they would only enter the Darbar wearing their shoes. And the Rajas would say, no, nobody enters the Darbar wearing shoes. And these battles would continue for generations at times. In Hyderabad, it continued for 2 generations. 2 Nizams refused to allow shoes in their Darbars. Ultimately, there was a little boy who was on the throne, 3 or 4-year-old kid, Mahboob Ali Khan VI. At that time, they finally came to a compromise because the boy obviously didn't have an opinion on this. And the Diwan gave the British something, the British gave the Diwan something, and that's how the British got to wear their shoes. Often, British residents could be manipulated. It wasn't that just the Rajas were being manipulated, there was counter-manipulation. People knew, who the British resident was sleeping with, where they had illegitimate children. In Trivandrum, Resident Cotton, who appears in your book as well, Mr. Palat, there's this wonderful saying in Cochin and Travancore. In Malayalam, they say, "Mettail cotton undo," which is that, in your bed is there some cotton, because Mr. Cotton was quite promiscuous and had a habit of jumping from bed to bed. And having this kind of knowledge, so it wasn't just the British picking intelligence on the princes also knew where the weak spots were. And if the one agent of the British in your court could be manipulated, well, that was one way of making sure that imperial policy suited you, as and when you wanted. In Indore, a Maharani sends the British resident a basket of fruit, very sweet fruits, how nice. And then the man starts eating the fruit, and then he realizes there's actually gold coins hidden under the fruit. And then he gets very upset. He says, "Is this a bribe? How dare you send me these gold coins?" The Maharani very coolly says, "Were you expecting more? You can just ask. There's no need to throw such a drama. Just tell me if you want more." Other ways of manipulation. In Jaipur, their treaty with the Maharaja very clearly said that any revenue above the sum of 40 lakhs, the British had to get a slice of it. And Maharaja of Jaipur was Ram Singh II, a very fine photographer himself. He was definitely a modernizer when it came to setting up schools, colleges, roads, gas lights in the streets. All of those things were fine. But he would refuse to modernize the collection of revenue in his kingdom, because he realized that if I modernize the collection of revenue and create annual reports, the British will know what I'm earning. So he deliberately kept revenue collection old-fashioned in the local languages so that they would not be able to access it. And his revenue was always 39 lakhs, 38.5 lakhs. Always under 40 by a small margin, never over 40. And the British knew this. They knew that he had up to 60 lakhs in revenue, but they could do nothing. In fact, we often assume that the British could come and lecture Rajas. It actually wasn't all that easy. In a state like Udaipur, highly feudal, highly backward, no roads. In fact, in the reign of Fateh Singh in Udaipur, the number of roads actually fell because he wouldn't even maintain the roads that were there. Terrible, terrible ruler. But the British could not dragoon him, because they feared the Rajput states were located on the frontier, close to the frontier. And remember, this is the time when this great game with Russia is going on. And the British have this perpetual paranoia that the Russians will come in via Afghanistan and conquer India. And therefore, they couldn't alienate the Rajputs. And Fateh Singh of Udaipur was the biggest Rajput chief that was there. He knew it, they knew it. So they asked him once to raise some kind of a certain number of troops. It took him 30 years, and finally he raised one small battalion and said, "Look, 30 years later, this is what I'm giving you. They asked him, even Lord Curzon, who had a habit of lecturing princes left, right, and center, when he came to Udaipur, he had to be extremely mild. He couldn't lecture the finest, tallest Rajput leader that was there, simply because he thought the Rajputs would be affronted and they would not like it. In fact, this particular Rajput also had this habit of having diplomatic illnesses. As I said, the British would trot out these Rajas for all these processions and darbars in Delhi, and the Rajas knew they were being demeaned. To go up in front of the Viceroy and sort of bow and to sort of scrape in front of the Viceroy in public was demeaning. So the most clever Rajas would all conveniently fall ill when it came to the actual day of the darbar. So they couldn't disobey the British, so they would come to the darbar, and then on the morning of the darbar, they would send their regrets saying, oops, I have a fever, oops, I have something else. And again, the British knew, and again, they would be very upset, but they would not be able to do much. It would take years and years before finally capturing one particular point on which they could pin down the Raja and then try and depose the Raja and whatnot. Which is not to say these Rajas were all great people, which is not to say they were good people. All I'm saying is they were politically interesting people. They were not people chasing skirts. They were not people chasing wild animals with their guns. They were not people just building palaces every time it suited them. There was something more interesting happening in the princely states. Now you take a single example like Sayajirao Gaekwad of Baroda. He challenges so many ideas we have about what it means to be a prince, right? This is a boy who at the age of 12 is picked up from a farm near Nasik, where he's just an ordinary kid, can't even read and write, but he's a distant relative of the royal family in Baroda, where there's a succession crisis. So they come here, pick up this 12-year-old and park him on the throne saying, you're the next Maharaja of Baroda. Illiterate boy. Suddenly he has to start acting like a Maharaja. He's bombarded with lessons in English and like values and democracy and whatnot. And of course, loyalty to the Raj, because that's the biggest lesson the British give any prince, that you must be extremely loyal to the empire. Turns out that when he gets power, he's not very loyal to the empire. In 1881, when he's barely, 17, 18 years old, he's told that, before you get your powers, you have to sign a document saying that you'll have provisional powers for a few years. He says, fine, but give me a definite timeline. They say, no, whenever you want, we'll then, remove the conditions on your rule. He says, no, I want a clear deadline. I want a clear line mentioned in the agreement that I'm going to sign. Turns out he's being secretly advised by that same Tukoji Rao Holkar of Indore that I mentioned earlier. And these two, that Maharajas told him, you better not sign on anything without a clear expiry date for that agreement. So he finally gets his way. Then the British realized that this boy they've tutored and trained to be loyal to the empire is actually in touch with all the Congress politicians in Pune. Because in those days, Pune was where the editors of the Marathi press were. Jyotiba Phule, the great social reformer, was there. He was in contact with them, borrowing ideas from them, learning from them. Again, the British didn't like it. Then he decided he's going to start going abroad. And again, the British don't like it because it's not the Maharaja's business to go abroad and sort of hobnob with European royalty at equal levels, because that was offensive to the idea of the British. But he would insist on going. In fact, once one of the princes was coming to India and then he was passing through Baroda. And Curzon wrote to Sayajirao Gaekwad saying, you better be there to receive the prince. And Sayajirao said, I'm not a servant to stand here to receive a prince. I'm going on a European holiday. And off he went, and the prince had to just pass through Baroda with nobody waiting to receive him. He's the one who, in the main, funded Dadabhai Nauroji's election. He's the one who, despite the British telling the Maharajas in the late 1880s itself not to fund the Congress, in 1900, Curzon finds evidence that this man is still being giving money to the Congress party. The Maharajas are funding even regional organizations like the Pune Sarvajanik Sabha, the Deccan Education Society, which ran Ferguson College, and Ferguson College attracted a lot of revolutionaries who like to shoot British people. So when the Maharajas are going and putting money in a revolutionary factory, obviously the British know what's going on here. So you put pressure on me from here, I will put pressure on you from there. That's essentially what these Rajas were doing. And Sayajirao Gaekwad's, I suppose the favorite story I have is that it turns out that he was allowing a lot of anti-British propaganda to be published in Baroda. So the British would find that bomb manuals were being published and sent to Bengal and so on. And once Bombay police raided Baroda and found two places where they were printing this propaganda, turns out it was a book. On the cover it said vegetable medicines, but then you open the book and it turns out it's a bomb manual. And they pin down the Maharaja and say, look, we've caught you with a gun and you're now in trouble. Maharaja, without sort of losing his composure, says, Before we come to the question of the bomb manuals or whatever, on whose authority have you entered Baroda to conduct the raid? Legally, I am the sovereign of Baroda, so Bombay police has no right to enter my territory till I give permission. So this whole case collapses because your evidence was collected the wrong way. And then the British say, okay, fine, we can't do anything to the Maharaja. At least the officials who are in charge of these districts, they have to be sacked. Maharaja doesn't sack them. In fact, he sort of demotes one of them. The other chooses to resign, and Maharaja gives him a 10,000 rupee present, which is again making a statement saying, under British pressure, I may be forced to let you go, but here I am, giving you money to make sure that the people know that I'm actually on your side. He used to attend Congress meetings. He used to give lectures in which he spoke about national culture, national government. The word national appears in his speeches a great deal. And there's 4 volumes of his collected speeches. And you will see that perhaps no other Maharaja used the word national as often as Sayajirao Gaekwad did. His gravest sin, though, was in 1911 when the King and Queen of England were personally present in Delhi at the Delhi Darbar of 1911. And the Rajas were told, look, you must go up to the king and queen, you must bow, 5 times or 7 times or whatever it was, 3 times I think, to both the king and the queen, and then walk backwards without showing them your back, and then go back to your designated spot. And most of the Rajas sort of didn't like it, but they were compelled to do it. Sayajirao Gaekwad's big crime was that firstly, he didn't come wearing his jewels. He came wearing simple white clothes with 1 string of pearls, without his British medals and decorations. That was, problem number 1. Second is he walks up with a cane in his hand, which is nicely swinging. So he's got this completely casual vibe as he's walking up to the king and queen of emperor, who, mind you, are sitting on the throne looking very statuesque and regal. And here this man is with his cane. And finally, he does not bow to them 3 times. He sort of tilts his head briefly to the king and then turns his back and walks off. This is too much for the British. They've got bomb manuals, they've got revolutionaries, they've got Congress funding, giving lectures for the Congress party. This insult to the king, and it was caught on camera. And it was played in these British cinema halls over the next few weeks and months. And then they said this is sedition. The Maharaja has to lose his throne. He has to be deposed. At this point, finally, Sayajirao Gaekwad says, okay, fine, I better play down my nationalism a little bit. Let's not get too carried away with our sort of, pro-India attitude. So he sort of mellows down, becomes a little more coy in the way he criticizes the Raj. And he starts allowing his officials to criticize the Raj rather than himself saying anything, because he knows his neck is now on the line. The irony, though, and this is where the earlier cliche comes in, is of the Rajas is very loyal to the British. The irony is that when he died in 1939, a very old man, he's still, writing and saying that the British must give India dominion status, they must treat Indians well, at an equality with Canada, Australia, etc. The New York Times does an obituary in which they call him one of the most loyal of the Indian princes, which gives you a sense of why the cliche continues. Because on the face of it, people see a Maharaja must be loyal. Why must we even peel back the layers and look at any other stories that may or may not be there? Other forms of resistance in Mysore, for example, in the 1830s, Mysore Maharaja Krishnaraja Wadiyar the third, Mumudi Wadiyar, he was forced to give up power. It was an invented controversy, and they said this is misgovernment, and Maharaja, we're taking over your state. For 50 years, they did not give him his state back. Now the Maharaja realizes that he has to keep the idea of the king alive somehow. If the king isn't ruling, what is the king meant to do? Very neatly, he moves into the spiritual level. Very neatly, he moves himself to the religious level, and suddenly kingship becomes religious. It's about giving grand donations to temples. It's about having his picture plastered all over the place, sending out portraits to different parts of Mysore. All the same, he's also waging a legal battle in London. So while he's doing this for Indians, using religion and temples as a way for his subjects to remember him, he's also equally spending money in London to get lobbyists to directly deal with Parliament and give him his state back, and ultimately he ends up winning that particular battle. In a state like Travancore and of course Cochin, these 2 states realized that one way of keeping the British away is by being better than the British at governance. One big excuse the British had was misgovernment and maladministration. So if you outperform the British districts, then the British have no legs to stand on. Which is why from the 1860s, the Maharajas of Cochin and Travancore both start improving the access to education, access to schools, access to healthcare, and so on, precisely because that's one way of keeping the British at bay. The British can't come and lecture you if you're doing this. And the divans they import, they also develop a sense of nationalism. If you look at the readings and the writings of M.G. Ranade, for example, one of the founders of the Congress, a great nationalist figure in British India, You'll see that these nationalists, Dadabhai Nauroji, again, he was a Diwan of Baroda. We speak about his election to parliament, but we forget that he was also a Diwan himself. These icons of the early nationalist struggle looked up to these princes. Because in British ruled India, they were told, you natives don't know how to govern yourselves, therefore the British are here to civilize you, to teach you government. And then these men could point at the princely states, at Travancore, Baroda, Cochin, and they would point back at the British and say, look, these Maharajas are doing better than you. They're spending more on education than you are. They're spending more on health than you are. Therefore, your whole argument that you're here to civilize us, you're here to teach us governance does not stand. And that is why there was this wonderful correlation and wonderful sort of overlap between the Congress party and the princes. The other thing is women. Now this is, in princely politics, we've spoken about Parukutti Nethyarama, one fine and towering figure from one princely state. But the princely states were full of women who knew exactly how to flout British norms and how to irritate the British. In Jaipur in the 1830s, there was a regency. There was a very young prince, and his mother was made the regent of Jaipur. Now we imagine Indian princesses all, behind parda, they're all languishing there. Either they're all like plotting against everybody else, that's the cliche the British created, or they're really sad and lonely and they're just lying there in despair, weeping all day long. And of course they're very perfumed and decked up in jewelry. That's the image of the zenana that we have. But parda was also used by these women very strategically. It was selectively applied depending on who was on the other side. For example, this particular regent in Jaipur, if it was dealing with her own ministers, members of her own court whom she trusted, no parda. She was perfectly fine with meeting them. She had no issues dealing with them. In fact, Indian royal women had a strategy of getting out of parda. In my second book, Rebel Sultans, I talk about one of these, which is how they would sometimes feed their breast milk to these men. So the men become their sons, honorary sons and brothers or whatever. And then there's no parda, because now you're welcome even across the curtain. So Maharani of Jaipur would keep all her courtiers on this side of the parda. But any time the British resident wanted to meet her, she'd say, oh, no, parda. I am a parda lady, so I cannot have any dealings with the British. And the British recognized very early on that this was a way of keeping them out and keeping the Indians in. And they recognized it, and the British resident ended up leaving Jaipur as well. And then, eventually the regency was toppled, the princess died, and the British took full charge of the state. But they had to wait till she died. In Baroda, we have the story of Jamna Bai. At the age of 13, a bit like Parukutti Nethyarama again, a teenager. She's married to a man nearly 20 years older than her. She's growing up in a village called Rahimatpur, the daughter of a village headman, so not from a royal background herself. Then she hears that Maharaja of Baroda is, he's been married twice. Both times he's been unlucky because he's had no children. So he's decided he's going to try a third time. So this poor 13-year-old girl is picked and given to this 38-year-old man, and she becomes his wife. Unfortunately, she doesn't have children while they are married. At the age of 17, when she is 17, the Maharaja dies. Now in Baroda, the options are two. One, the Maharani has to either produce a child, which is the next ruler, or the Maharaja has a brother, he succeeds to power. And the brother is your stereotypical textbook case of a bad prince. Tries to murder people, harasses women, kidnaps them, all of that. So bad character. The British don't like him, neither does Jamna Bai. In the 1880s, there's a record that a senior British officer writes where he says that, these Indian widows, when a Maharaja dies, it's very interesting that all that time they've not been pregnant, and then the moment the Maharaja dies, they declare themselves pregnant. And that's essentially what Jamna Bai of Baroda does. All these years, she's not had children. At the age of 17, suddenly she's pregnant. Her brother-in-law doesn't believe it. He's like, this is a way to mess with me. I am entitled to the throne, and here's my sister-in-law, this girl who's come from some random village trying to snatch power. But either way, she's declared herself pregnant. Now you have to wait those 9 months or whatever, how many months they were, to wait and see if she gives birth to a male heir. And the contest between them, and that it gives you a sense of this young girl, very clear and very determined to seize power. The Maharajas, she likes wood apples. So the Maharaja her brother-in-law starts sending her wood apples, except they're injected with poison. She's cleverer than that. She doesn't eat those wood apples. She starts cooking her own food in her own bedroom, sleeping with a dog tied to her bed and with a dagger under her pillow. He starts bad-mouthing her, saying, this is some other man's child. First he claims there's no pregnancy at all. Then he says, this is some other man's child. Finally, the Maharani realizes that she's not safe, so she goes off to the British resident's house, and she's the only Indian woman to ever give birth to her child in the house of the British resident rather than in the palace. Her brother-in-law is no fool either. He follows her to the British resident's house, and he waits outside the door while she's giving birth to make sure that the baby isn't swapped, a girl child with a boy child. That's a level to which this power obviously matters to both these people. Unfortunately for her, it's a girl. Now, you would imagine that ordinarily an Indian princess defeated this way, in this political contest, she would just go back into the harem and disappear, become yet another widow in the royal harem. But she did not. Jamna Bai had a lot of jewelry her late husband had given her. With the jewelry, she goes off to Pune again, same place where all the politicians are. And very shrewdly, she starts investing her jewelry in funding complaints against the Maharaja. So here she's selling her jewelry, getting the money, sending the money to Baroda, telling people, you go and complain against the Maharaja. You also go and complain against the Maharaja. So the British resident is constantly getting these letters and notices from the public in quotes, saying this is a bad Maharaja, he's oppressing us, he's this bad, he's that bad. He doesn't realize that this is actually Jamna Bai it's funded entirely by Jamna Bai. Equally, she's also funding his own subordinates. So the British residents' own employees are in Jamna Bai's pay, where she's bribing them also to fan his animosity against her brother-in-law. So 5 years later, the British have had it. From every direction, they're getting bad reviews about the Maharaja. They topple him from the throne. And who comes back to the Baroda palace? Jamna Bai herself, all the way from Pune. That is when they go and pick up that 12-year-old boy from the field, not because he was the only option. There were 3 other people in the line of succession, but they were all too old. The British realized if they put a grown man on the throne, he wouldn't be entirely amenable to their control. And Jamna Bai also realized that she was only in her early 20s. If she puts a 28-year-old man on the throne, he's not going to listen to her either. So they now form an alliance and they decide, let's kick these people out. One of them gets exiled all the way to Banaras, rightful claimant to the throne, and they pick up this 12-year-old boy because both of them think that they can control how this boy turns out. Again, as I said, Sayajirao didn't turn out to be very pro-British. Equally, he proved that he was not attached to Jamna Bai's apron strings as the British had feared. And that's when she finally sort of recedes from the record, but not without a fight. In 1882 or 1883, after he's come to power, and as I said, he's already showing the British that he has teeth and he can bite. She writes a letter to them saying, you can clearly see that his self-sufficiency is very bad and he's not listening to you. So let him stay as a token Maharaja, but let me be the ultimate state authority in the state. And the British at this point, because they're also a bit sexist, they say, no, a woman can't be at the helm of affairs. So they don't allow her too much influence. Also, they're a bit annoyed because her private life is notorious. She has lovers, oh my God. So, for that reason also they refuse to sort of take her seriously. But they have to give her an allowance, they have to give her own separate palace, her own establishment. Until her dying day, she remains very much in control of her little fiefdom. Because that's what she's decided, that she's not going to be a nobody. She's going to be somebody of importance. And there are multiple cases like this of various Maharajas and Maharanis, especially royal mothers, who find ways of thwarting the British. In Travancore, Maharani Setu Parvati Bai's son was separated from her, with good reason, I suppose. She had been caught doing black magic and, conspiring with the press against the British and so on. So he was sent off for administrative training in Mysore. And the Maharani was said, you can only meet your son once in God knows how many ever months. That's the only contact you're supposed to have. Maharani was shrewder than that. She was smuggling letters to him in the turban of one of the tutors or somebody. So the son and mother had a clear contact going on, and she was advising the son on every point. If your tutor says this is what you're supposed to say. If the British resident says this is what you're supposed to answer. On every point, she managed to retain her hold over her son, even though she was sitting miles and miles away. Now, I have a feeling I'm talking for far too long. So I'll just wind up with why the Maharajas ended up with the bad name that we've given them, or we ascribe to them these days. Which is quite simply the fact that despite their romance with the Congress, despite the fact that so many congressmen saw them as icons, saw them as nationalist icons who ruled well, who delivered good things to their people in Mysore, Travancore, Baroda, even in some of the North Indian states like Indore, by the 1930s, the Maharajas became something of a bad word. For the simple reason that till the 1930s, late 20s, Congress nationalism in a great sense was elite politics. It was about people in suits in the English language talking about nationalism. The Maharajas were supportive of the nationalists to that point. The moment under Gandhiji, slowly through the 20s, Congress became a mass movement where the peasants got together and it became vernacularized. It was Indian languages. It was the Indian people standing up as a mass to power. The Maharajas got very uncomfortable because they started realizing that, this formula could be used against us as well. At this point, the Congress and the Maharajas, despite their long marriage for nearly 4 or 5 decades, now have something of a divorce, and there's a falling out between the Maharajas. Remember, Gandhiji, as late as 1934, refused to let the Congress party intervene in princely politics because he said that's like interfering in Afghanistan or Sri Lanka. They're different countries. The Congress has no business going there. Gandhiji had great regard and reverence for lots of princely rulers because his father was a princely divan. He himself was from a princely state. He called the Maharaja of Mysore a Rajarishi. He had dealings with Parukuti Netyaramma, the Maharani of Mysore, of Travancore. He compared to Lakshmi. He was very reverential to the Maharajas because he saw them as political figures connecting India to an older heritage. The British had come and uprooted lots of things in British-ruled India. In Indian-ruled India, the Maharajas represented a continuity with the past, a connection to our own heritage, so he was respectful. But Nehru and the socialist wing obviously did not like the Maharajas. And with the Maharajas getting a bit anxious about mass politics, naturally there was a falling out. And by the late 30s and 40s, the Maharajas shoot themselves in the foot because they are shooting at their subjects, clamping down, repression goes up in the princely states, the press is being censored, all of this is happening. At this point, finally, the Congress and the Maharajas split, and in the 1940s, we know that, ultimately, with a carrot and a stick, Sardar Patel went to them and said, you either sign if I offer you the carrot, or the danda will come out. And in a princely state like Hyderabad, which was the premier Indian princely state, it was very clearly the danda that was used. In our textbooks, we learned that there was something called Operation, the police action that took over Hyderabad. It's a very cute little word that says the police went in and took over Hyderabad state. In reality, it was a military invasion. There was, aerial bombing involved, and an official report which has still not been released. It's leaked, but it's not been released officially by the government of India. Estimates that between 25,000 to 40,000 people were killed during and in the aftermath of that particular exercise. So it was an armed takeover of what happened, of the so-called police action in Hyderabad. And the princely states, this kind of history still matters to our current politics in a certain measure. If you read the book of, the recent book Ambassador Nirupama Rao wrote, she talks about our attitude to China. When China took over Tibet, one of the reasons India sort of looked the other way was because we had taken over Hyderabad, and that was also pending in the United Nations. So if you decided to be, let's say, holier than thou about Tibet, then somebody else, China, could be holier than thou about Hyderabad, and that could create embarrassments for India. In a lot of the princely states, in 1971, the privy purses that were paid to the Rajas were abolished, but even now, India has officially recognized princes. We still have an official Zamorin of Calicut who still paid an allowance by the government. We still have a Prince of Harcourt who gets a police guard and an allowance from the government of India. There are still legal princes who exist in India. The bad name that they're sort of languishing with even after independence is partly also of their making, which was that having lost power, many of the Rajas set up hotels and tourist spots in their erstwhile capitals, for which they also had an incentive to dress up in silks and look pretty. And so everybody just reduced them to the tourist brochure cliche, and they've been stuck with it since. And of course, the final piece is Mrs. Indira Gandhi. I begin the book with a quote from Indira Gandhi where she says, go ask your Maharajas how many wells they dug and how many roads they built when they were in power. You will find that the grand total of their achievements is zero. It's not true. But she was saying it not because she was a committed socialist, but because the privy purses being paid to the princes was being channeled by the princes towards opposition parties against the Congress's dominance. So a bit like the princes used their resources to goad the British once upon a time, in post-colonial India, they used their resources to needle the Congress party and support the Congress's opponents. It was for that reason that Mrs. Gandhi cancelled the privy purses and said that the princes have to be wiped out of history and so on. And they were, legally speaking. But to this day, they retain their relevance. If you go to a city like Trivandrum, when the Maharaja of Travancore walks on the road, he's just an ordinary figure. He's an ordinary citizen of a democratic state. But the moment he enters the Sri Padmanabha Swami temple, he again transforms into a Maharaja. And when he escorts the deity to the beach for the ritual, arat and so on, the great ceremonies of the temple, he's escorted by police guards who are armed, and they treat him very much as the Maharaja. And the international airport in Trivandrum even shuts down. The Mysore royal family at Dashara in Mysore to this day sit in public on their throne, and the people come and pay them regard. In fact, they live in Mysore Palace, which is occupied partly by the government and partly by the royal family, because they still have this quasi-official status over there. And finally, even if Maharajas have gone, The idea of kingship and the way of dealing with politics like Maharajas continues. Maharajas were what? Often they were custodians of religion, custodians of tradition. When our current Prime Minister, for example, goes to the Ayodhya temple consecration, for example, when he's seen performing religious rituals, Arvind Kejriwal in Delhi is also performing religious rituals, they are all tapping into an older form of legitimacy. They're all tapping into an older memory of cultural legitimacy, not constitutional legitimacy. They are essentially trying to fill the role that once upon a time Maharajas played. And Maharajas themselves, meanwhile, have adapted to democracy, which is why the Scindias of Gwalior are elected not only in Gwalior, but in Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, all over the place. Which is why in Trivandrum, before every election, every candidate goes to the Kaudia Palace and has a photo op with the royal descendants over there. When Prime Minister Modi, as a candidate, came to Trivandrum in 2013, he actually went there and they gave him a shawl and put a little turban on his head and so on, almost as if they were endorsing a candidate for democratic elections. So the Maharajas, whatever their past may have been, they're still present very much in 21st century India, perhaps not with any kind of prominence, but certainly they haven't been wiped out completely, and certainly the story continues in a sort of small footnoted way. I'll end this lecture here. Thank you.
Thank you, Manu. We'll open the floor to questions.
Mr. Pillai, that was fascinating stories, and glad to know the Maharajas were nationalists and the British, spread fake news like we hear now. They were, it originated from them. But my question is, since the Maharajas were nationalists, didn't they try to get together to overthrow the British, or they were not kind of connected to each other, or why didn't they take that step, or why didn't that happen?
I would qualify the term the Maharajas were nationalists because not all were. As I said, firstly, of the 565 states, most were microscopic estates. About 300 are just in Gujarat. Small zamindaris are just got classed as princely states. In reality, there were 100 or 120 big princely states, which were these states. And not all of them were nationalist or whatever. Some of them very firmly attached themselves to the British cause, but many did not. So there's no clear singular policy there. On the question of why and if they united and so on, the Maharajas had one problem, which is that despite the very many resources they had at their command, they had lots of money, many of them had armed troops. You must remember that princely armies fought in Africa during the Boxer Rebellion in China, in World War I and World War II. The only signatory to the Treaty of Versailles, the only Indian signatory to the Treaty of Versailles after First World War is a Maharaja from Bikaner. It is an Indian prince who signed that treaty. And he's there in the big painting that was done at that time. So they were certainly active and they had resources, but they could never unite because the Maharajas ultimately, the weight of culture and history weighed down on their shoulders. So the Nizam of Hyderabad was too prominent to sit down with any of the other Maharajas. He saw himself as the last representative of the Mughal Empire, who would not diminish himself by sitting with other petty princelings. The Rajput rulers would look down to the Marathas saying, no, Marathas are new money. We are the old money, and therefore we will not sit at an equal level. In fact, Udaipur Maharaja, one of the reasons he skipped many of these royal processions the British orchestrated was simply because Udaipur would have to walk behind Baroda, and Baroda was a Maratha. And if Udaipur went back home after walking behind a Maratha, his own subjects would sort of, lampoon him and criticize him. So the Maharajas till the end found that they could not quite unite. They had their petty rivalries, they had their own notions of their prominence, their caste status and so on, as a result of which they never became one united bloc. The British feared they might, the nationalists feared they might, but it never happened.
Thank you. So as a corollary to that, why within their own kingdom did they not overthrow the British? Because the British has military firepower or some other reason?
The British had in terms of hard power, the British were stronger.
Absolutely.
They had the armies. In fact, even when the British realized in the 1880s that the princes could together give 300,000 men to the Indian army, the British did not want that army to be too strong. They did not want the Maharajas to have the latest weapons. So even when the Maharajas had armies, they were typically, by law or by the treaties they had signed with the British, they had to be within a certain number, and their weapons were always slightly lower grade than what the British had on offer. So military action was never an option. That's why the Maharajas had to resort to more creative methods of standing up to the British.
Going back somewhat, I mean, what about the Maharajas during the Mughal rule? I mean, when the Mughals were there, I mean, they were sort of completely, shall we say, in control of the whole country, more or less.
Who, the Mughals?
Mughals. What were the Maharajas doing then?
Actually, the Mughals were never in full control of the country. The way pre-modern India worked was that you would get a local Maharaja to give you tribute, and you would not actually intervene beyond that, because ultimately nobody sitting in Delhi had the resources to go into a princely state, go down to village level. There wasn't that kind of bureaucracy, there wasn't that kind of communications capacity. So long as the Maharaja or the local power paid you tribute, you were happy to leave them in their seat and just maintain a kind of overlordship, which is what the British also continued. It was in the British era that railways started going into the princely states, roads started being built, and the English language allowed for a press to exist that reported on everything happening everywhere else. Till the 19th century, it was extremely difficult for any one ruler to maintain full control over any kind of vast area. In fact, even the Mughals, they had a core area that was under their control. The rest was all parceled out to subordinates. It was all parceled out either to hereditary Maharajas or officers who would move around. Sorry. Yeah. They had to depend on them. They had to depend on them, which is why the Mughals always faced rebellion in some corner of the empire or the other. Because no matter where you were and how powerful you were, somebody or the other was always trying to break free. So the Mughal armies were always going up and down trying to put these people back in their respective rows and positions.
You briefly discussed the instrument of accession, and we know about Hyderabad, Kashmir, and Junagadh and places like that. But reading V.P. Menon's book, there are a lot of Maharajas who are actually quite loyal. Pataudi comes to mind, and people like that. Can you talk a little bit more about the trend? What actually happened in the months during the accession?
During the final years, during the instrument of accession period.
Yes.
So again, most Maharajas were quite willing to sign because they realized that this was the way the wind was blowing. The funny thing is that as late as the 1930s, the mid-30s, the Maharajas had the option of carving out a future in post-colonial India. In fact, in Ranaday's scheme for post-colonial India, the late 19th century, he envisioned a House of Commons type lower body where the British Indian people would send representatives, and he envisioned a House of Lords where the Maharajas would be present. So the Indian Parliament would be a combination of both. Both would continue to exist. Even in the 1930s, what is called the 1935 Government of India Act and so on, the then constitution that was created for India, much of which still continues, by the way. The Maharajas, it was called the Federation Plan. So the Maharajas and Princely and British India would form one federation, where in certain respects the central body or whatever parliament type structure that would have been there would legislate, but the Maharajas would retain a certain amount of autonomy. What really spoiled things for the Maharajas was one, their capacity to sort of never unite. The other was that partition changed the thing completely. Because once a huge segment was cut out of the country by the Muslim League, the Congress party became very clear that India had to have a very strong center, and balkanization could not be allowed. If you allow Maharajas to have that much autonomy and power in their respective states, India would be a very weak sort of federation and union of states. A state like Travancore, just as the British feared that the French, Travancore being on the coast, the French might find it a platform if the Travancore Maharaja went over to the French to invade India. Congress also started fearing that Travancore, which had thorium reserves and therefore was increasingly important in the emerging Cold War, might become a platform by which the colonial powers would continue to influence what was happening in India. So they decided we had to have a very strong center, so the princes would have to go. Interestingly, the instrument of accession was not about annexing the states to India. The princes only gave up defense, communications and foreign policy to the Indian Union. They were still autonomous within. It was only in 1949 that the integration of the states took place, and the Rajas were told, look, your states have to merge with the Indian Union, and that's when they ultimately lost power. And by then, they realized with partition, with the Congress being so powerful, and with armed action against the Nizam where tens of thousands of people were killed, resistance was not an option.
Hi, you have pointed out very correctly like how Maharajas played a good role in the struggle of freedom of India. But can you please highlight a little bit on the struggle that the freedom resistance, like the resistance to the freedom came into the picture when the Gandhian revolution started to take place after 1930s, of course. As far as I know that there was resistance from Maharajas as well to the Gandhian revolution that was happening around, because it was kind of taking their power away as well. So can you please highlight on that part a little bit on?
Yeah, because as I said earlier, the moment it moved to mass agitation, the Maharajas were very uncomfortable. And the other thing was also, the socialist wing in the Congress was very keen to go into the princely states. Now, till then, princely politics worked on very local issues. So even though there were politicians in the princely states, they worked around caste, they worked around religion, they worked around those issues. So in Mysore, there was a Brahmin party and a non-Brahmin party. In Travancore, there were the Iravas and there were the Nayars and there were the Christians. It was all local formulations that existed. And they were trying to get more and more power from the Maharajas. In the 1930s, they realized, based on what was happening in British-ruled India, that hold on, if we unite and form state congresses, we can apply better pressure on the Maharaja because now there's no internal divisions. So suddenly in these princely states, you start seeing the Mysore State Congress, the Travancore State Congress emerging. And the Congress realized, the main Congress in British India realized that, look, we want to penetrate the princely states, let's just ally with the state congresses. State Congress realized that the princes are always cautious of what the Congress is saying, let's ally with the Congress party. So a marriage took place between the state congresses and the British Indian Congress for mutually beneficial purposes. The state Congress would get the prestige of the main Congress would get local representation in a simple sort of union between these two formulations. At that point, things started getting violent. More and more people started being thrown in jail. People were shot at. There's something called the South Indian Jallianwala Bagh, which happened in Viduraswata in Mysore. In Travancore, there's something called Pune Pravaila, where machine guns were used against the people of Travancore and blood flowed in the streets and so on. So this kind of violence breaks out in this period because ultimately most of the princes were autocrats. They could be good autocrats, they could be wonderful, individual rulers, they could be really good at what they did, but structurally it was autocracy. Even Sayajirao Gaekwad of Baroda, who foresaw that the princely states would ultimately have to go. He openly admitted that if India had to become a nation, the princely states would have to go. In the 1920s, when his own Diwan produced a draft constitution type of document saying that we will have elections and the ruler will become like a titular head, even Sayajirao Gaekwad said, no, I'm not giving up that much power. Ultimately, I'm holding on to the power. So when their own power was questioned is when they started having issues with their own subjects and they lost the sympathy of their subjects in great measure in this time. Interestingly, Cochin was an exception. The Cochin Maharaja was more than happy to encourage people's activities and activism. In fact, a little mischievous also, the last Cochin or the penultimate Cochin Raja, when Travancore started having a communist problem, he started helping the communists from their papers would be banned there, they could be printed in Cochin. And it wasn't like there were hard and fast boundaries. Anything printed in Cochin would end up in Travancore also. So, there were some Maharajas who were quite pro-nationalist, even in that phase, but the bulk of them saw that the end of autocracy would be bad for them and they tried to resist. The bridge between the nationalists and the princes. See, firstly, it was not in the, I would argue that it wasn't for some larger altruistic cause. It was for self-interest. The Congress needed important Indians to support them because it gave legitimacy to the Congress. So every time the Maharajas funded and supported the Congress and spoke at Congress platforms, Congress's prestige went up because these were respected figures in British India. Similarly, by courting the nationalists, the the princely states were also putting the British in a slightly awkward position, and that was a deliberate strategy. Because the Maharajas saw themselves as legitimate figures. Today, sitting in 21st century India with our current map, we think that this is the only legitimate shape the country can take. But back then, that was not how it was. The princes saw themselves as legitimate figures. Their ancestors had been ruling for centuries. The people saw them as legitimate rulers. We hear the word plebiscite usually in the context of Kashmir, but the people of Pudukkottai in Tamil Nadu, small state, 1,200 square miles, they demanded a plebiscite because they didn't want to be merged with the Madras presidency. They believed in the idea of Pudukkottai as represented by the Maharaja. In Baroda, when the accession with India was signed, the people were not jubilant because the Maharaja served them well. They had schools, they had roads, they had everything. So the memory of the Maharaja was still pretty strong. In Cochin also, the Maharajas were extremely popular with the people, and in Travancore to a certain extent. So the princes saw no reason, therefore, to give up their powers, and that's why they maintained these bridges with the Congress till there was utility for both sides of the equation. Ultimately, it's the same sort of cynical politics that exists today, which is that there are ideals, certainly, but much of the transaction politically is also very utilitarian. It's based very much on, sort of Machiavellian goals and agendas.
There's a speech that Shashi Tharoor gave, I think, at the Oxford Union about the destruction of India by the British, and the economy was so great before they came in. But talking about these Maharajas, the allies and false allies among themselves also, would you say that were the Brits not around, we wouldn't have India as a country today? It will be a bunch of balkanized states?
We would, yeah, I mean, it's naughty to speculate, but the last big power in India that the British defeated were the Marathas, and it took them till 1818. We often assume that Battle of Plassey in Bengal, the Nawab lost and that was it. From then, India became a colony. Actually, no, it took the British nearly some 50, 60 more years to slowly build up power. In 1818, when they finally kicked the Marathas out of their dominance, is when the British finally prevailed. So perhaps the country would have existed in some shape where there would have been some kind of Maratha overlordship over large parts, and then the rest of India would be under these local chiefs, etc. One can't argue that they would not have modernized, because for their own interests, they would have modernized, perhaps not in some kind of blanket or wholesale importing of Western institutions. They would perhaps have modernized on terms that suited them, that suited their power and suited their cultural outlook. As I said in Jaipur, you modernize your roads and colleges, but you don't modernize your revenue administration. It would have been a much more selective way of modernization, but the shape of the country would have looked different, certainly. We would not have had the current map of India that we have.
Thank you. Thank you, Manu.
Thank you.
Subscribe to Sarmaya and be a part of the stories and conversations around art, history, and culture.